Great, there you are.
And Development Studies webinar. So this is the first webinar for the second term of the year for the University of Johannesburg's two departments, namely sociology and ADS. ADS stands for Anthropology and Development Studies. So we actually host these webinars almost every week during university calendar. And the webinars have been done in collaboration with, what is it, Baba? In collaboration with the sociology department. Term one was hosted by Professor Patrick Bond. Those of you who know his work or those who work in political economy would actually know a lot of his publications, have read his work. So this term, I'm the one who's responsible for organizing these. And basically, just to give you a bit of a context of how these things transpire. So a lecturer who hosts has to select a theme based on their own field of interest or their own academic research interests. So because I too work in this space, I'm largely interested in political economy, looking at it from a decolonial, Afrocentric, and feminist perspectives. Then I basically am hosting this month. And of course, Dr. Ongama gracefully agreed to be the first speaker for our inaugural series of this particular one, under the specific theme of African and feminist political economy. With that being said, I'm not going to waste time. I will begin with introducing our colleagues. Just also sort of briefly, I know both of the speakers, the speaker and the respondent, don't need much of an introduction. Some of you have read their work in the public space and also in the academic repositories as well. Some of you have also been able to see them, especially Dr. Ongama, who's been doing a lot of public commentary in the media. With that being said, so as you all know, Dr. Ongama is a lecturer at the University of Nelson Mandela, in the Department of History and Political Science or Political Studies, and his main focus is on political economy. He has a really great CV in that regard. Somebody who's worked in the private sector before and now in academia. So he brings a rich history into the academy. And he has, of course, published in a number of academic journals, as well as media platforms. Then our respondent is Mr. Christopher Morris, whose work as well, by the way, interestingly has also touched on issues around crime, gangsterism, and of course also he's written on a number of topics that cover political science, also which intersects with race, gender, and a number of other important issues. So with that being said, let me stop there and allow Dr. Ongama Mtimka, our presenter, to begin with his presentation. Over to you, Ongama.
Good afternoon, Dr. Mokoena and Chris and the rest of the colleagues that have joined. Thank you for the honor of presenting at this session today. I'm really excited, but also nervous because of the great CVs of some of the colleagues that are here. Please pardon the car background. My flight delayed. I was supposed to have landed in Joburg 2:15. That would have given me enough time to drive to my hotel and then be seated, show you some slides as I present. But yeah, sorry about that. I'm not driving though, just in case some colleagues get concerned that I'm on the road. So just a little bit of background to this topic that I've chosen. Dangerous classes, the Lumpenproletariat, urban development dynamics, and capitalism. So let me start by the topic itself. I did my PhD looking at the political economy of transformation in the construction sector in Nelson Mandela Bay. This topic I'd become interested in because, as Prof. Bond would know, I started working at the Kucha Development Corporation. Him and I crossed swords back then on different sides of the ideological divide. So I started working at Kucha Development Corporation in 2006, and among some of the things that I think were done right, there are many of them, depending on who's speaking, was a contracted development program leveraging EPWP policies. So back then, what happened was that because there was a lot of construction work taking place at Kucha, and the project being driven by engineers who were progressive and understood not only the need to deliver infrastructure that can attract investments, but also do so in ways that were empowering to citizens. We ran a contractor development program, I think one of the few successful ones under the EPWP program. All that this was, for colleagues that don't come from construction, was that you took people that had potential to run construction businesses and enrolled them on a program in which you ring-fenced some construction work and gave it to them and allowed them to grow as entrepreneurs over time. So Dr. Bridget Gasa was a female in his 20s when she became an executive that was in charge of this program. And it had succeeded in the sense that many of the contractors there had moved from grade 1 in construction to grade 4 in construction. Sorry about the GPS prompts there, colleagues. I'm sure we'll arrive very, very soon at my hotel. So many of the contractors have graduated from grade 1 in construction to grade 4. And then I moved from there to go work for the Nelson Mandela Bay municipality. I had thought that because remember, for me, this was a political idea, this was a political imperative, that executives acting within the context of a state-owned company would be able to, embrace political imperatives of transformation while attempting to implement a development project. So I thought that this was quite interesting as a politics major. So I go and work at a municipality. When I went to work at Nelson Mandela Bay Municipality, I had thought that because a municipality was much more political than Kucha, which was a company rather than a municipal entity, I thought that the ideas of driving transformation in construction would be embraced with a lot more rigor and clarity of political program and leveraging than Kucha did. In fact, what was quite interesting was that this program, EPWP, was in tatters and in chaos at the municipality. This is around 2010-11. Chaos because of the deeply political embeddedness of the actors there. the close proximity between a municipal council and the politicians who direct it, as well as the community stakeholders who are beneficiaries. So here, the entrepreneurs were a lot more political than the entrepreneurs at Kucha. The entrepreneurs at Kucha had seen themselves as beneficiaries of a government program, and therefore there was a much lesser degree of entitlement to the initiatives than the entrepreneurs or political entrepreneurs at the municipality. And so there were lots of fights. The program was battling to take off. Anyway, I left there to go and work for a non-profit in Zwede Township. And at this time, I'd completed my master's in SA politics and political economy. So while I was in Zwede Township, it must have been in 2012. Oh, sorry, important detail. While I was at the municipality, the Stalini group that had been successful in delivering Zuma in Pulukwane came back and were running a program of a purge. They were purging the Beckites and were taking over the administration politically. And one of the very progressive things that they passed was a budgeting principle of how to split the capital budget of the municipality. And this principle was that 80% of the municipality's capex was now going to go to formerly or previously disadvantaged wards, and this was going to be um, in tarring of gravel roads, in servicing of further sites for RDP, in servicing of sites for social housing, and in upgrading of informal settlements. So this was amazing. I mean, it was amazing because while in Nelson Mandela Bay, you had Motherwell as a site for urban renewal, as announced by Mbeki in 2001, along with Mtanzane. There wasn't a critical mass of construction projects in the rest of the city in the same manner that they were in Motherwell. So when these politicians adopted this budgeting principle, all of a sudden you had an outbreak of development projects or construction projects happening in more places than the group of areas that are in Motherwell. Okay, excuse the pun there in group of area. I'm gonna pick this up when I discuss this issue about the dynamics of urban development. Anyway, so while I was working at Ubuntu 2012, I'm no longer in the scene of contractor development. I've now moved to the NGO space where it's healthcare, education, psychosocial support. So it's community development proper. It's no longer physical infrastructure, investment promotion, and those types of things. I hear that contractors are closing sites in Gqeberha, and they're closing sites demanding a share of the construction work. Now, this was fascinating to me because while at Kucha, long before BEE legislation, long before BEE had become an act that was in force, we had the codes of good practice. And Kucha was prescribing, higher contractor rates for
OG, we've lost you.
Can you still hear me, colleagues?
Yes, now we can hear you.
What time do I have, by the way, Dee? Uh, Dr. Mkwena, just a confirmation of time, please.
So it's 15:14 now, so you still have 15 more minutes.
Great. So I'll run through the actual slides. This background is important for somebody who hasn't read, my thesis. So I was saying while we were at Kucha, we had started the entire BEE verification process before there were verification agencies in the country. And we were enforcing compliance with BEE targets. And the codes of good practice had just come out. This was the mid-2000. The BEE Act was still a bill and it had not yet come into force. And KUHA was prescribing 30% BEE scoring from companies. And this was at a time when it was not the law. It took a court of law to say to KUHA, you have to stick to the between 10 to 20% that the law prescribes. And I'm saying this was corporate activism or state-owned enterprise activism as far as I was concerned. So for me now to see contractors starting this as a mechanic, using protest, using political tactics to stop projects and demand 30% of the work, I knew that it was a function of two things. One, the municipality had not been successful in running its own contractor development program. And I think KUHA, as a result of the law that curtailed its activism around BEE compliance, or which was more than what the law required, had failed. And as a result of this, you had emerging in society uh, from people who wanted to benefit more from construction jobs, these protests. At the time, the stadium was being built, and so there was a lot of success, by the way, and the Eastern Cape was leading the country in being a construction site. So the construction industry in the Eastern Cape was a lot more successful. Now, I am building this paper that I'm now presenting bigger than bigger than where it comes from, which is this background that I've just given. But I am borrowing the conceptual framework that became emergent in my thesis. So it became quite clear for me that as I was studying these groups, I was coding the data from the grounded theory interviews and line by line coding. I observed particular characteristics of our variety of capitalism in the country and how people who could be construed as the ultimate dangerous classes, were attempting, one, to describe it for themselves and then engage in behavior which was violent in order to try and impose transformation in it. So the Lumpenproletariat, or this concept of the dangerous classes, it came to me just after I had coded my data and I was writing from the discussion documents of the ANC. Because as somebody who didn't really grow up in Marxist intellectual thought after my first degree, I was using political economy thinking more to answer the pragmatic questions that we were grappling with at KUHA, in the municipality and elsewhere, than as an exercise in scholarship and development. So this was a new term for me. I mean, it was quite fascinating that the ANC introduced this concept. And indeed, as I looked at what they were characterizing as the Lumpenproletariat, there was a correlation between what my subjects were describing themselves to have been doing and how they were describing the space to be. So the Olympian proletariat mainly is referring to these construction groups, what has been referred to as the construction mafia. So I'm explaining the concept for you, the construction mafia. And then Jennifer Irish Koboshiane has done a study of organized crime, and I think actually two. I saw two of her works in organized crime, where she looks at heists and she looks at mainly heists, and I think she touches on other elements of organized crime in South Africa. And I think, stumbled upon the work of Johan van Lochenberg also around the tobacco wars. And well, interestingly, from Johan's work, is what seems to be blurring the lines between uh, big business and the what are these guys called who are smuggling tobacco? Let me call them tobacco smugglers for now. But I think Johan van Lochenberg introduces some complexity, because he talks about how among some of these guys that are labeled as smugglers are in fact independent manufacturers, and then also some of this behavior which we would readily characterize to be belonging to these lumpen groups is in fact originating from mainstream tobacco. And so he chronicles in his book about the events that led to the unique counterintelligence work, among other things. So these are the groups that I'm referring to. Urban development, for me, is referring to the bringing together of development in previously disadvantaged wards, such as Motherwell, Mdantsane, and other urban renewal sites. And then also the rapid development of infrastructure, social infrastructure mainly, in previously excluded black townships, mainly from Quebec. And then I talk about capitalism because from these groups, I got an interesting characterization of South Africa's variety of capitalism, which I deal with in my chapter, probably 2 or 3, and then in my findings, that in fact, South Africa's capitalism is anything but free market. That there's a lot of collusive behavior, there's a lot of unfree behavior that's taking place. Now, in the rest of the presentation, I talk about how our modern capitalism, or our variety of capitalism, originated from a process of mass impoverization of the hinterland, of the rural areas, and in a process which many scholars have agreed about, whether it's Luli and Alex Kalinikos or Mel Lipton or some of Eknukaitobi in terms of the latest contributors to that debate, or Sampiter Blanche, for example, we have consensus about how the violence or the foundation of South Africa's capitalism, first by the English in transforming the feudalist system under the Dutch, and then the mining, big agriculture, and big industry, was directly a function of the proletarianization, sorry, the impoverization of the hinterland, and the remaking of the majority of the population as unfree labor or cheap, docile black labor. So that's that. And then secondly, I talk about concentration. That it's interesting that whether you're looking at capitalism from a South African variety perspective, and by the way, I think it's Nicola Natras in South Africa who uses this term variety of capitalism. There may be others also. Um, or you look at global capital as characterized by Thomas Piketty, or in fact, Sampiter Blanche in his Western Empires book, you see that, or what Prof. Bond calls global apartheid. You see global inequality, huge concentration of production processes. And I say that this is important for us in South Africa because this concentration is characterized by a feature of South African economic sectors as having a big five or big four of sort. In every sector, you have a big five. And this is reflected in manufacturing, or in fact in extractive industries, big agriculture, big mining, and then in secondary industries, in manufacturing, and then in tertiary industries, in distribution and retail. That's concentrated all the way from extraction to tertiary sectors. So this is important in terms of what does it leave the rest of society dependent on, because it says that the production, even consumption, is concentrated. The thing about South Africa is that it's always been regarded by South African capital to be a small domestic market. And the reason why that domestic market was small is a function of the fact that the rest of the citizens were excluded from meaningful employment so that they could remain poor and therefore be part of the army of cheap labor, which was intentionally created for South Africa's early versions of capitalism to thrive. Now, from around 1970, that started to transform because it had become apparent that you needed a critical mass of skills, and South Africa's Calabar legislation had prevented that from happening. So I'm talking about that when I talk about this system. Now, the contractors who are battling to gain access into the sector and grow. In fact, to access the sector is fairly easy, but it's growing in the sector that's a problem. So construction has also this. Now, the reason why you have this concept of Lumpenproletariat and dangerous classes fits the majority of the population in South Africa is because of what Stats South Africa calls the um, neither in employment, education, or or training. Okay, I've got data here that shows, you know, the labor market dynamics, the impact of education on employment, where we see that South Africa's 12% who have got post-matric qualifications are affected in lesser ways by unemployment than their uneducated counterparts. And then the data on this need, which constitute the mass of the lumpen proletariat, and then inequality as the most unequal economy in the world. And then we see economic crimes, carjackings, robbery, and robbery and residential premises, and then corruption is high, and the activities of the construction mafia. Anyway, in a nutshell, just to summarize, what I'm saying in a nutshell is that urban development, and we have seen, I think it's McGuinty and others who write on post-conflict reconstruction and development, that processes of bringing about development trigger conflict. The reason why they trigger conflict is because they alter, and I argue this in my thesis, they alter the known structures of representation in a society, such that if, for example, in my case, in my PhD, if there was a ward committee that was known to play the role of, mediating benefits from construction projects, or mediating benefits from, retail developments that are coming into townships, the fact that those ward committees move from being planning structures to being structures that mediate benefits trigger interest from others that were not interested in becoming ward committee members, who all of a sudden become ward committee members because precisely of this development that's now coming in. And we have seen that in other places, this is in line with the resource curse thesis, that once development is undertaken, it triggers sometimes war and war economies, where groups fight over who's going to control benefits from the upcoming development. And so when I talk about urban development and its dynamics, I'm talking about how these people in the urban centers are fighting over opportunities that are being brought to communities as a result of development. And lastly, Dean, this is my last landing. I was curious because in my study, I realized that, wow, there's a clash of cultures in this story of the construction mafia versus mainstream business. In Nelson Mandela Bay, for example, these guys didn't want to tender. They said, no, we're not going to tender for work. Give us the work and we're going to distribute it among ourselves. At face value, this sounds corrupt, but it took me, who comes from a rural area, to appreciate elements of my subjectivity, talking about decolonial theory, to accept that actually back home we used to laugh at the idea that in PE and elsewhere, in a traditional ceremony, the distribution of meat and alcohol and all the benefits that a host of umcimbi or ceremony would have for a community, which are distributed by Injoli in the rural areas. We would laugh at the idea that in PE it doesn't happen so orderly. So Injoli in the rural areas plays the role of, it's not a master of ceremonies per se, but it is. But also it's a person who distributes or is in charge of the generosity of the usokaya, the person in whose house we have come, and usually serves the purpose of distributing these benefits according to tradition, according to age, and according to gender. They know which prime portions of meat belong to the women, which prime portions belong to the elderly, which portions belong to amakweng, the boys. And so this is not a contested mechanism of distribution. When Injoli has decided, and the Injoli has decided, and what protects Injoli is not his own will, but the custom and tradition that accepts that this is the standard in terms of distributions. So when these guys are saying to institutions, we don't want to tender for work, we are going to distribute it according to intloko zenyoka. And this is a concept, the concept of intloko zenyoka is exploited when, for example, there's brandy that is being distributed. It's done 2 rounds, say for example, of being served to everybody, and now only a little bit is left. And if Injoli then evokes the concept of intloko zenyoka, what they are saying is that this is going to go to the respected in society, and nobody's going to question when that principle of intloko zenyoka is evoked. Again, there, so I saw that while this mechanism of distribution that is imposed by these guys from rural areas in these urban settings is frowned upon by us who want benefits to be distributed in from free market principles. It was something that was helping us to confront the logic of competition, to say, must you always distribute things according to competition? Or could you take tenders and look at a community and say, hang on, all of you that are fighting about this work, let us get in Zenyoka here. Let's take all those who've got families and are elderly and give them the portions of the work. And then from there, everybody else who is a startup in terms of new owner of a house or whatever the case may be, it gets this. The point I'm making is that it was confronting what we take for granted in South Africa's variety of capitalism and actually shining a spotlight on how it itself is not so free and equal. Am I saying that these guys who are killing people left, right, and center and intimidating others, theirs is an exercise in revolution? Certainly not. But I'm saying that they're coming in and they're bringing their elements of rural subjectivity, as Marx observed of the Lumpenproletariat, and are demanding that we actually interact with the values that they are proposing. And these values make free market values not the nature or the natural order of things, but something which we must compare with the other values and determine whether, in fact, we can craft new ways of doing things. Yeah, so this is where I am, and I hope that it makes some sense. Thank you. I pity Chris now because I didn't share my slides. Only now am I arriving in the hotel. Thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Thank you so much. All right, thank you, Baba. Um, thank you so much, OG. I mean, that was a very, very wonderful presentation, very rich. And I think there are a number of elements that you've touched there, which I'm hoping that in Chris's response, he'd be able to share with us as well his reflections on what you have presented. So basically, I think for me, just to add and abuse my chair's position a bit, I think what caught me the most was largely, particularly the argument and that you're making around, for us to really be aware and cognizant of the variation of capitalism that we have, or South African variant of capitalism, right? And how you're also incorporated, or rather how you've your own sort of subjectivity, particularly which then actually brings in this notion of standpoint theory, right? That your own privilege as somebody who's grown in a specific context, an African-centered context, then you were able to use your own social location and history and context to be able to understand, so basically the responses from the respondents that you had interviewed and you were working with. Yes, Baba. Okay. Sorry, I have a 2-year-old here. Um, and then of course this idea of a non-free market system. Of course, there are other people, right? A number of other scholars who've shown us. Please give me one moment. Okay, just give me. Hang on, who have argued and shown us that really there is really nothing of the sort when people talk about a free market system, right? So scholars such as Jun Chang have also shown us, have reminded us as well. Okay, so you know what I'm gonna do? I'm gonna give Chris the baton so that I can give my 2-year-old here the attention that he wants. Okay, so Chris, over to you. Okay, please give me Baba. This is called social reproductive labor. I think feminists would actually understand this. Okay, Chris, over to you.
Still muted. Oh, hi. Good afternoon, everyone. Hi,
Okay, Baba, wait.
Hi, baby. Hello, baby. Good afternoon, OG and Tikeledi and everyone. Thanks for that, your presentation, and congratulations. I think it's really informative, and it's helping us understand quite a few things, particularly questions around transformation, the development, values, how we see ourselves. So yeah, I'm working. It wasn't said in the introduction, but I'm working for a TV show, Generations, and one of the characters has just gone to jail. Her own personal story as a character. She starts off as a gangster, and then eventually she becomes a small business owner in Alexander Township, running. Sorry, running a shebeen as well as a private investigation service. And her role in the community has changed over time, of course. She's from Mama's Gebengu, as she's known. She's now Lucy, the successful business owner. And this, as thinking about my own personal story, history, how our grandfather was engaged in raising his kids engaged in activities that were criminalized by the apartheid government, but also generally considered criminal. And so this question of how we see ourselves comes up for me, going back to questions of race, identity, but also as you speak about capitalist formation in South Africa, how capitalism was founded, the violence it was founded upon, but also its the racial, gendered, and class elements. And I think your presentation speaks to these questions and raises questions about how do we understand these lines that are drawn between the criminal and the legal, the formal, and the informal. So, yeah, like I say, on questions of transformation and development, what your presentation forces us to consider is how do we understand what transformation and development looks like? Who is transformed? What is transformed? Who and what is developed? Because as you say, you know, a lot of these projects are taking place in townships that are or still maintain a certain spatial relationship for people in South Africa, those who live in these townships, racially constructed townships, and so when these projects take place, on one level they reinforce them, but as you say, on another level they create these conflicts about around development and distribution and what the transformed township would look like, and gives rise to these chaotic relationships, the chaos of the project itself, but also the relationships between these various actors, the politicians, the entrepreneurs, and the supposed beneficiaries. And I think your presentation forces us to kind of deal with this chaos, which is becoming more and more important in questions of development. And then, so yeah, that was something I found very interesting. Now, when it comes to the agency of the so-called dangerous classes, these Lumpenproletariat, you know, in the classical conception, I guess, of the Lumpen and the way I've come to understand it, they sort of not an important, a secondary class, if you like. As you mentioned, the revolutionary potential is not as profound as the working class. But I think now what your presentation brings to the fore is that these other varieties of capitalism, actually the Lumpens enter the stage and become an important class, if you like. I'm just thinking now of Haiti and the sort of relationships that have led to the situation we see now, where the gangs and the big gangsters are basically competing for state power. They've shown that the state doesn't have a monopoly on violence and are actually taking over, creating a really chaotic situation. But these gang members that have become so powerful were empowered through political and economic elites, empowering them, giving them guns, and now they've become autonomous. So my point is that, you know, when we look at capitalism, the dynamics of capitalism and development, these classes, when in the context of a variety of capitalism, not our as we classically understand it, they become much more important. So that was something I really found interesting in your presentation. The next was your conceptual framework and the innovation around this Marxist term, Lumpenproletariat, and what I would consider a liberal term, the interest group theory and this conceptualization of interest groups. So this innovation of yours of understanding the Lumpenproletariat interest groups is quite interesting. And it's something I think we can really get a lot out of as we think through this. Having said that, you go on to talk about Injoli, which comes back to what I was saying earlier about how do we understand ourselves, because Lumpenproletariat, this term is quite loaded historically, and even the ANC, when they use it, are using it in a dismissive sense to say these are just criminals. So what you're doing is, on one level, you could be changing or trying to challenge how we understand the term Lumpenproletariat, or on the other hand, you could be saying that actually these sort of terms don't work and they don't describe how the agents understand what they're doing. Maybe in Jolly is going closer to where how these actors understand themselves, particularly because they are local, they have ties to the places. So then this lumpen sort of characterization becomes a bit difficult, but that's your problem, I guess. So now coming to the important point you made about how do you understand capitalism and its characterize it in South Africa, and your point about it being an unfree free market, if you like. And I think that's the quite an important point if we want to understand political economy, not only in South Africa, but globally. I mean, it's violence is foundational to a capitalist uh, political economy, but it's also ongoing, and it, at times it becomes ultra violent. I mean, Gaza. So the news is actually littered with this thing about how this idea that capitalist relations require a measure of violence, a measure of conflict. And so it does come to the point you're making about the processes of development trigger conflict. And because of the challenges to incumbent political or economic beneficiaries, and development changes these relations. So, you know, I think your presentation speaks to our situation that we currently in, and some of the failures, if you like, about how we've failed to understand transformation from a values point of view. We've kind of looked at transformation as we need to become capitalist. We need to become entrepreneurs. We need to understand these systems, and actually, have we gone back and this is taking me back to the African philosophy questions about development. What does development mean, and who is it for? So when we speak about development in these communities, do we just assume that they'll provide tenders and, you know, compete in the free market, or do we actually go and understand development from where people are, the values that they possess, the self, how they identify themselves? And I think you're making a very important point, or touching on something very important about the values and conceptualization of transformation and development. Thank you. I think your presentation has raised a lot of questions for me and hopefully for the audience. But thanks, OG. I really enjoyed it.
Well, thank you so much, Chris. So what I'm going to do is we are going to open up the platform for reflections from the audience, questions, comments, and hopefully answers or responses. Soon as OG, Dr. Mtimka, somewhat shares a few words in relation to some of the questions that you have raised. Over to you, Dr. Mtimka. Dr. Mtimka, are you there? Dr. Mtimka?
I am sorry. I was speaking and I was muted here. I'm trying to join on my MacBook, by the way, and I'm struggling, but I'll see if I can join. Um, so very interesting comments from Chris. I welcome many of them. So interestingly so there's two concepts that these groups are exploiting. Now, in my thesis, I talk about how new ways of looking at things were imposed by the groups as they sought to make and remake institutions. So, for example, what is regarded one, these groups were carving a new market space for themselves. It's a market space, right? And were leveraging political tactics to do so. And then what happened was once as part of, they reconceptualize things as they go. So, for example, when I was at Kucha in the mid 2000s, local for us meant you came from the Eastern Cape. Okay. And then when I was at, when projects were in few areas in Nelson Mandela Bay, there were groups that were trying to carve local as Motherwell, but the general consensus was local means you come from Nelson Mandela Bay, so you could do work in Motherwell. But as soon as that 80/20 capital budget spending principle was approved, all of a sudden you had a critical mass of projects in more wards than a few. And we saw attempts to redefine local as no longer coming from the city, but coming from the ward. And the reason why these actors were trying to do this is because they were splintering from citywide forms of organizing to more ward-based forms of organizing, in line, I argue, with the new flow of development money and development projects. Now, as a result of that, they evoked another concept of saying usokaya. So usokaya is the host of the traditional ceremony. Injoli is distributing benefits on behalf of usokaya. But the Patusoka is important because they then said, these guys, we are the hosting ward. And there's not even hosting. I mean, anyway, we are familiar from mining with this idea of host communities. So they would evoke principles like, we are the hosting ward, therefore we must benefit first, or 50% of benefits must come here, and then 50% can go to the rest of the city in splitting the 30%. Anyway, that's one thing. And then something you spoke about the gang, about the generation's character. Sorry, I stopped watching soapies about 10 years ago, so pardon my ignorance there. But it's an interesting concept because, you see, if you follow the history of economic sectors, you find that at their foundations are gangster-like behavior. Pakamisa Nzamela, in his book Native Merchants, he tells the story of how in Kimberley there was this governor in the 1800s, was a very progressive English governor. And there was a group of white diamond mafia that were trying to pressure this governor to relax laws about who could own diamond mining businesses. These guys were trying to get this guy to come up with a racial limitation on who could own diamond mining businesses. So they were wanting the blacks to only be allowed to work as laborers. And this governor was telling these organized white interests to take a hike, and for some time refused to accept their bidding, to do their bidding, until they became a rogue element in the same way that the construction mafia is today, as part of the mechanism of closing out blacks from diamond mining. If you go to furniture sector in New York, the clothing sectors. These guys who became formal, emerging from gangster controlled economic sectors, guys that were protecting the market for one group. And then also Neil Ferguson tells us the story of how the British Empire caught up with the Spaniards and the Portuguese, that without and this is why, by the way, if you look at in England or in countries influenced by Western Europe, there's this romanticization of the pirates, right? And and Neil Ferguson makes the point that it was rogue gangster Henry Monken who invaded Grand Granada, that was, I think, owned either by the Spaniards or by the Portuguese, stole all the gold and silver that was there at port, burned every ship that was there, and then fled. So he did a daring heist and stole other people's loot. And Neil Ferguson makes the point, I think this is in his book, The Empire. And so began the story of Britain's catching up and building of a maritime empire. So at the foundations of economic sectors, at the foundations of capitalism, is gang behavior, it's violence. And again, and then I talk in my thesis about a beautifully told story by what's this guy who writes a book, Once Upon a Time in Russia. His name is escaping me now, but is a Russian guy, Ben Mesrich. Ben Mesrich. He writes a story of the process of the development of the oligarchs in Russia during the time of Boris Yeltsin, the rise of the Roman Abramovich, the and the Berezovskis, and all the billionaires or oligarchs in Russia. That the process was actually like this: the scrambling over previously state-owned assets. Well, the oligarchs were going around with former KGB agents and former army generals as they were scrambling over previously state-owned assets. Yeah, again, and I evoke that from a historic, a path dependency character of capitalist sectors, and not a romanticization of these activities. And by the way, somewhere in my thesis, I even problematize this immediate characterization of these groups as lumpen versus a mainstream economic actors. Because as we saw from our competition commission, that the mafia behavior is not unique to these new guys. The mafia behavior is the actual modus operandi of South African capitalism today, not at the foundation back in the days. Anyway, yeah, thank you. That's all I have to say in response to some of the issues that Chris raised. Thank you.
All right, Siyabonga, thank you so much. So we actually have so much time left, which actually would give us 30 minutes in total for interactions and questions from the audience. So I've just enabled Mike. So if you would like to speak or say something, raise a question, raise a comment, share your reflection, hopefully not give a lecture. This is the time to do that. So any audience, I mean any raised any person from the floor with a burning question, comment. Yes, hi Sean. You may have the floor. Your mic is unmuted, but we can't hear you, Sean. Sean, can you hear us? Okay, so it seems like for some reason Sean's mic, although it's not muted, but we cannot hear from him. So I'll hear from Dr. Trevangwani. So yes, please take the floor. I'm gonna.
Yeah, yes, thank you. Thank you very much for a great presentation. Of course, I agree with Christopher that the term lumpen is very loaded, but maybe it's appropriate in this instance. I'm not sure. But I do want to raise a bigger question about the nature of capitalism itself, because I've just heard our main speaker saying that we shouldn't think that there's a big difference between the legitimate guys and the mafias, because I think there is this idea, and it's a question, there is this idea that there is a good type of capitalism and a bad type of capitalism, which is fair enough because, I mean, social formation, modes of accumulation differ. So, you know, there could be terrible atrocities or thievery going beyond the pale. But I do want to question whether, you know, such research couldn't underline the commonality in this mode of accumulation that essentially it does lead to behavior which is antisocial, and it is based on private property, which viewed historically consists of stealing, you know, land dispossession, and things like that. So I just wanted to comment on that. But this is a great presentation. Thank you very much.
All right, siyabulela Ntate Ngwane. So Eva?
Yeah, hi. Thank you so much, Doc, for your presentation. Unfortunately, I had a lot of network challenges, so I couldn't follow the entire presentation, but I just picked on a few comments when my network was a bit stable. And coming from Ghana, I just want to say that what you have in South Africa is not entirely different from what we have here. Capitalism, to some extent, has caused many more problems than expected, especially in this day and age where the rich continue to get richer and the poor continue to get poorer. I don't want to go so much into details, but having said that, I'm just curious about the recommendations of this study. I don't know if it was mentioned, but I'm just curious because I missed out on the entire presentation. So if you could just take me through one or two of some of your recommendations in relation to your topic. Thank you.
All right, thank you so much. Dr. Bond, over to you.
Oh, I hope one day I'll get to be called Comrade Patrick or Patrick when we're discussing capitalism, not formalities, because Ongama has reminded me of wonderful comradely debates about whether there's a system that is reflected in Kucha of a special economic zone that I think, I don't know if you'd agree with me, Ongama, varieties of capitalism in what you've described, the theft that's so systematic that allows our big bourgeoisie to be rated #1 in the world by PwC for economic crime and fraud, right? If you survey every couple of years, actually this year we're #2 behind India, tied with China. But during the 2010s, our bourgeoisie, and you can tell them by the color of their skins, it's the white boys in Sandton and Stellenbosch and Mhlanga, they rank #1 in economic crime and fraud. To underscore your point, this is a variety of capitalism that's based on theft. Wouldn't there be a better way to put it? I'm just asking if accumulation by dispossession is a term my own, to be, full disclosure, my own supervisor, David Harvey, came up with to describe the capitalism, non-capitalist relations. Rosa Luxemburg, kind of introduced that. Harold Wolpe, Articulations of Modes of Production. In your political economy, did you not want to work with some of those great classical ideas where capital moves to theft? Your let me call it a lumpen petty bourgeois accumulation in the construction industry, corresponds with the lumpen bourgeoisie of the extractive industries. And that's why I was fighting you, if you recall, dear comrade, back in Kucha days when the proposals were to bring in the big extractive industries. Now I would include Beijing Auto Industrial Corporation, First Auto Works, and maybe a couple of others that are coming through, because they steal our electricity. Way too much of our electricity goes to big capital-intensive, high pollution, especially high carbon products. That's another kind of accumulation. And a very final point, if you use varieties of capitalism, are you not falling into the trap that my dear great mates, they're departed as of last month, Eddie Webster, or as of a couple of years ago, Vishnu Padiyachi, they brought this varieties of capitalism. As you said, Nikli Natras, okay, frenemy, she brings it. And they don't want to talk about racial capitalism, about super exploitation, about uneven and combined development. So they've got this little trick, varieties of capitalism, because what they want, and Eddie was so explicit, a pro-poor capitalism. Now, I mean, I'd love there to be a patriotic bourgeoisie. I'd love to be in a country that had pro-poor capitalism, but aren't we dealing in fantasies? And isn't there a danger, Ongama, that your theoretical framework is based on, let's say, a confusion? In a place like South Africa, we have the most super exploitative capitalism in the world. Why mess around with varieties? I mean, this is something we need to overthrow, isn't it?
Oh, that's a lot of food for thought. I hope you're ready, Ongama. So before you respond to that loaded question, very interesting one, let's hear from Sean. Hopefully you'll be able to be unmuted now. Hopefully your mic works. Yes, we can hear you now. Sean, we can hear you. Do you mind maybe just increasing your volume? Because it's a bit faint. In the interest of time, we could give Ongama some time to respond while you are resolving the mic issues. Is that okay, Sean? All right. I am. So.
Okay, I think that works, D, so that I can also be able to give some substantive inputs. Look, I've given up joining on my PC, so I think that my screen may be like upside down when you look at it. I'm fascinated by the feedback. Let me resist the urge to go straight to what Prof. Bond was saying. So let me start with I accept from the first speaker. Sorry, I did get the name. I accept from the first speaker the idea that indeed it's a problematic concept. So I've now submitted a paper for review where I'm saying, let's conceptualize these as interest groups, but where do they fall in political science? Now, this is now the organizations themselves, the construction mafia or small business forums, as they call themselves. Let's grapple with them in the South African political economy lexicon. So I'm submitting in as Chris correctly points out, because he's read the paper, I'm submitting there about Lumpenproletarian interest groups. So it's going to be interesting to see what debate comes from that. But you're quite right that it's a problematic concept for reasons that he mentioned, and also that Prof. Bond mentions. And then in terms of what my recommendations are, and I think it relates also to what Prof. Bond calls confusion. And the interesting thing is that I subscribe. So first of all, my study is not Marxist. So I'm not trying to do Marxism. I'm trying to do critical thought, critical inquiry to find out where it leads me. And I used grounded theory as a research method because I found that it lends itself to this epistemic humility of saying, if I'm looking at a phenomenon, let me give it the sovereignty to tell me what it is about. Obviously, as Roy Pascal tells us, when you then describe the phenomenon or when you describe reality, you must appreciate that it's multi-layered. And so your description of it is separate from the reality itself. And so by that value of epistemic humility, my interpretation of my grounded theory or my building of grounded theory, I accept that to the extent that it is my descriptions and what I attribute to the data is different from the data itself, then I accept that anybody can look at it and characterize it differently. And here is where my value comes as somebody who appreciates systems theory, that what we come up with in the collective labeling must be greater than our initial attempts at describing what's happening. I hope that I've answered colleagues. In terms of what I recommend then, in line with that, is to say, first of all, we must accept that we are not dealing with a free market in South Africa. We are not dealing with a free market. We are dealing with behavior that quickly creates exclusion of the marketers who are selling. Because remember, perfect competition in proper economic or textbook, capitalist textbook terms, should be a market where buyers and sellers do not choose who they buy from. Okay, now, so buyers and sellers do not choose where they buy from. That's a perfect market. But in construction, you have the contractor, the CIDB, the Contractor Industry Development Board, is a grading mechanism that says who can tender for what work. And it used some meritocratic principles of separating the small boys from the big boys, or the small girls from the big girls. Okay, and that mechanism itself introduces who gets to buy from who. But to go to what Prof. Bond was saying, I actually didn't know that our bourgeoisie were ranked top in economic crime and fraud. So it strengthens this view that I've had that, in fact, what we're dealing with is not a disjuncture between an otherwise good mainstream and a bad emergent Lumpenproletariat class that wants to impose itself. That's interesting. I'm going to be looking at that more. Around this issue of accumulation by dispossession, very interestingly, it was my PhD, my colleague at WUSU, and also a student that I'm co-supervising, who brought it to my attention, this work of David Harvey around accumulation by dispossession. Initially, I was uncomfortable with the concept because I thought it was a conceptual misnomer, to the extent that from a South African history perspective, there was a time where dispossession happened en masse, and then what we have currently, it's what has morphed into either racial capitalism or capitalism proper that's unequal. It was not until I gave him, myself and Prof. Breakfast, with whom we are supervising Mbasa, that he was able to explain it to me in ways that, like, wow, okay, it's an interesting concept. So for now, it's an interesting concept I want to look at. I'm not convinced yet that it authoritatively replaces the characterization of a particular group that's neither in employment, education, or training, which seeks to impose itself in the economy. You know, I'm not convinced yet, but I see your point about how that may be a better term to characterize South Africa's capitalism itself, as opposed to the variety of capitalism approach. And by the way, I think that I'm going to group myself along with your colleagues there, because fundamentally, I am not, and I'm going to have to say this carefully. I'm a critic of capitalism, but I'm not fundamentally against some of its ideas, such as the ability to build capital, the ability to accumulate it, but I'm against the practices of exclusion. For that reason, I'm writing my book, Pathways to Inclusion, a Political Economy of South Africa in the 21st Century. And I hope, so what I've done with it, I'm constructing from a micro sense, what are individuals doing in non-profits and in for-profit businesses? What are they doing to tear down the walls of exclusion in order for them to participate in the economy? And what are some of the lessons we can learn with humility, not with grand theory, but with humility that says, let us be humble about what we can learn, and let us construct something building from decolonial theory. Because I advanced something in the thesis, for example, that says, I doubt very much that Africans were communist, because the same Africans that were participating in collective mechanisms of plowing fields are the same Africans that compete about ubuhle bendoda zenkomo. Okay, the ones that say the beauty of a man is in the cattle stock that he owns. So to me, this says that those cultures were as collective as they were individualistic. So then we're not trying. I am at least I interpret our culture not to be pushing towards communism, which is in its Eurocentric form. Nor is it pushing towards capitalism in its Eurocentric form. I'm saying, let us be humble to learn what it pushes us to and theorize that. Thank you.
All right. Thank you very much. Elaine, I see your video centered on the screen. Would you like to say something? Elaine Morris? Or is that sorry. Is that Chris? Okay, anyway. So thank you.
Sorry, DK lady. I think she made a comment in the chat about she's got a comment there in the chat. Elaine.
I can't hear anyone, colleagues. I'm not sure.
Oh, sorry. I actually had muted myself. Apologies. So I was reading Elaine's comment in the chat box where it states, I'm going to read for you. So it says, I'm disturbed by the very male perspective of the doctor and how this is not transformative, especially his example of rural homesteads. Women still seem to be marginalized within this perspective. I see this as part of patriarchal capitalism. Chris attempted to include a female as part of capitalism, but the idea was not fully developed. Where do women fit in this South African brand of capitalism? Have all women been included in this transformation, or only the political elite and the connected? Women do form a larger part of the Lumpenproletariat than any other classes within society. So I'd like for you to sort of respond to that shortly after Sean makes his comment. Sean, you have the floor. Okay, we still can't hear you, Sean. Perhaps maybe you could consider typing your comment or your question in the chat box, because we literally have about 10 minutes left. So we don't want to lose your comment and time as well, right? So okay. So and then this I see another comment as well. I'm going to read it just to add on to some of the comments. Hopefully you'll respond to Dr. Ongam. So Dr. Hannah says, this has been a fascinating seminar. Thank you. At the end of last year, I heard Dr. Professor Sonabile Mnwana gave a talk on the distributional conflicts around land, where he was grappling with the idea of community as more than territory, but also a group identity through which conflicts over distribution are taking place. I don't think it's published yet, but it might be useful to reach out to him as you continue with his work, with this work. It raised tricky questions about exclusion-inclusion dynamics linked to gender, patriarchy, but also nationality. So yeah, I think yeah. So basically, what we are these two comments, right? I think they're more explicit on, and just to touch on what you were saying, particularly on the notion of inclusion, and just to go back to what Professor Bond was saying around his critique of capitalism, that its inherent nature of one, sort of the arguments that you have made and others earlier, that inherently in its DNA is very sort of violent, right? So it's violent centric. So, but then also the other very sort of characteristic of it is exclusion, right? And hence you are seeing the way in which it is manifesting in South Africa, in this mass impoverishment, and of course systematic exclusion that continues. And then there's the other thing that he brought in, which I'm just going to link it to what you said, Dr. OG, when you said that at a particular time we had capitalism by disposition, right? Or accumulation by disposition, and that seems to have, we currently seem to have something else. But interestingly, theoretically, the concept that Prof. Bond was, in his response to you earlier, was that he was saying that, look, I mean, this disposition actually is continuous. So you're seeing the disposition and how the disposition is manifesting. And now, besides the fact that, you still continue to have landlessness, you still have some form of really exploitation of, and of course, others will challenge me for conflating the two concepts here, but super exploitation, of course, impoverishment, but also bringing in this idea of the crisis of energy that we have, right? So he mentioned that you have all these corporations that are actually sucking up most of our energy supply from institutions that provide energy, right? So electricity crisis also is then all of these companies that are taking. So that's a form of, the way that I understood it, that's also another form of dispossession that is manifesting in contemporary times. But just to go back to the idea of inclusion and exclusion, right? So and of course this is what also, and I love that you've mentioned decolonial theory as well, which basically states that the modern colonial capitalist system is exclusionary, right? It is crisis prone, and it's basically exclusionary on multiple levels. And I think then it brings in this intersections of or rather hierarchies of gender, race, sexuality, etc. That and the argument is, of course, in that you see other people who are gendered, who are sexualized, who are racialized, and then some of them are excluded, and that's the very nature of capitalism, right? It is exclusionary. So when you are, talking about this idea of inclusion in a system that's inherently exclusionary, and a system that's inherently crisis prone, a system that is inherently dispossessive, right? And a system also based on the presentation that you have made so far, that you've shown us, that this collusion is unfree, basically also violates in its very own premises and principles. So how do you respond to that? And then just linking it up with again the recommendations that Eva was asking for, or was asking about, right? So in that context, in all of this, what are your thoughts to that? And I think we have 5 minutes. I'm hoping that Sean will type his comment, so that you hopefully have time for it, or else we are going to lose it. So over to you, OG.
Sure. Thank you, colleagues, for who are pointing to the various works. So Nabile Mwana, I'll check his work. Fascinating concept around, conceptions of community as beyond a particular area, but also, affecting questions of distribution. And I can see why you think that work is important for me. So to Prof. Elaine. So I did not gender the work. In fact, this is grounded theory. So I looked at people protesting, I interviewed them, and then coded the work to say, what is happening here? So for me, what the impressions that are derived from my findings are findings of how I permitted the data to tell me what it's about. So I'm going to talk about how it has been interpreted from a gender point of view, because it's quite interesting. So it would be interesting on the side to hear what, particularly in terms of what I said, is being coded as male perspective, because I would really love to be aware of it, so that I can intentionally do something about. And I'm not saying what specifically, but here is the thing. The phenomenon itself, in fact, Lindiwe Sisulu comes to Nelson Mandela Bay in 2015 to roll out a massive 5 billion project, and calls contractors in a meeting. And these contractors rock up in a meeting, and they are counted, and it's 2,000 of them. I kid you not, over 70% of them were women contractors. And this was interesting because these women contractors were doing an interesting migration from, because remember, if you look at the informal sector, women are dominating it, at least in PE, I don't know elsewhere, in Gqeberha. Now, it was women entrepreneurs morphing from morphing from a particular version of the informal sector to entrance in the construction sector. And in the thesis, I explain why this was the case, because while there are barriers to entry in terms of succeeding in construction, these barriers aren't there as far as entering the sector, because all you needed to do, and I'm familiar with this because I used to register companies. All you need to do is to register a company, have it qualify for CIDB, and you are ready to go. So the majority were women. I don't know what that does to the gendering of the study, but I thought that's important. And they remained as the majority. However, something which the first time I heard gender comments being made about my study is when I was presenting the violent aspects of it. And how Professor Nomanglanga Mkhize says to me, Ongama, you realize that what you are doing here is you are theorizing what Black men do when they are facing desperation. And in fact, if you think about it, in the rural areas that you are describing, This is what these men would do when they are fighting, when push comes to shove, and they are excluded from supporting their families. This is what they do. Okay, look, I say supporting their families because in context, this is this is what was said, and for the first time, I thought about the a gender approach to what my findings are. Otherwise, until that comment, I hadn't realized that I was doing work which had any implications on gender issues. So at that point, I started thinking, wow, okay, maybe I too have a voice to contribute around gender issues. Okay. Otherwise, as far as my coding and analysis of my data, nothing had taken me beyond describing who the actors were to what the gender issues were, because quite frankly, they were not apparent to me as I coded the data. And then lastly, Dee, thank you so much for bringing back the accumulation by dispossession issue. You're quite correct. So when I was explaining how I had initially interpreted the concept, confronting it for the first time in Basa Mvenene's proposal of his PhD, um, I was I was taken aback by the concept. But when he then explained what is its import as far as dealing with the present manifestations of dispossessions, I was like, oh wow, okay, I've now taken note of it, and it's something that I'm going to be looking at. So you're quite correct there that this was my initial response. That wow, can you use accumulation by dispossession in the 21st century? And this was me, somebody who had interacted with dispossession as a phase in history and otherwise. But also we've got, I forgot his surname now, a retiree who put together who formed SARS. He's talking about South Africa as an abuse economy, because he says to me, look, when I combined SARS under, his surname is Stride, I'm just forgetting his first name, Charlie Stride, or Charlie or Charles Stride. He says to me, when Madiba asked me to combine customs and revenue collection, at the time, the share of taxation was that we were taxing corporates 40 something percent and individuals were around 20 something percent. I may not be getting the rates correctly. And he's saying it's interesting that now corporates are at 28% and individuals are taxed at 48. And this is part of his conceptions of an abuse economy. Then he goes on to say, if you look at also pricing behavior of our big business in South Africa, the consumer is abused significantly. And he explains how many people who buy groceries occasionally are duped compared to those who buy groceries regularly, know when there are specials that are not specials and all of those things. So, and then he goes to other elements where he shows how South Africa is an abuse economy. Again, as a person who embraces epistemic humility, I'm saying let's not shun the concepts at face value. Let's engage with them and be prepared to arrive at a conceptualization that's greater than our individual parts. I see Sean has dropped his hand. Let me see if he typed. Okay, I see he typed his question. Made a point on Twitter vis-a-vis the story of Standard Bank CEOs, 83 million payday. He pointed out the double standard of corporate leaders on strong arming employees to accept wages close to inflation rate, yet the same does not apply to the CEOs. Question is, how best do we deal with the exploitative and exclusionary aspects of capitalism, and how do we deal with the crisis of inequality? I ask this because of science research suggests that inequality is the biggest ticking. So I align here with Piketty and those colleagues that Prof. Bond was saying, almost to the effect that they were reformists of capitalism rather than overthrowing of it. I align with Piketty, who says that let's do something about these manifestations of inequality, because We are going to deal with inequality, such as with wealth taxes and other things, much quicker than we can have a revolution that overthrows the essence of capitalism. Thanks.
Hello. All right, thank you. Thank you so much, OG. We we have 5 minutes over time, but I'm really, really grateful for all the contributions. I'm grateful for all the comments, the questions, and of course, the presenters. Thank you so much, Christopher. Thank you so much, Ongama, for your time. So basically, before we leave, I would like to share something quickly. So as I mentioned at the beginning of the session, so these are weekly webinars. So next week, we are going to have another speaker from Uganda, Mrs. Eunice Musime, who is going to speak on the topic of why feminist economics matter. So I'm hoping there's great support of participants who are here online that you will join as well next week so that we can have a conversation and fully understand the importance of feminizing or rather engaging with feminist approaches to economics. With that being said, thank you very much. Asante Sana, may you have a wonderful, wonderful Wednesday. Hopefully, hoping to see you again next week. And if you do not mind, I will send you the invitation for next week's webinar as well. Thank you so much. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Greatly appreciated.